Okay, there is a formula to writing melodies, and you don't have to use it. This is just one way to do it. This is one way to write a melody, and it'll sound nice. So let's look at it. What we do is you can do this kind of on any scale. And what I mean is not like musical scale, which you can do it on any musical scale, but I mean on size. So I'm going to do this over a 4-bar chord progression. So these 4, and then we'll resolve to this last one. We'll just put like a whole note here. But if we had a longer chord progression, we could do this over 8 bars or 16 bars. We tend to do it in groups of 4. That's just how we like our music to be, is in these patterns of 4 or 8. So I'm going to do a small one where it's over 4. What we're going to do is, first thing, we're going to divide it in half. So I'm going to look at the first 2 bars and then the second 2 bars. Okay, so this is going to be called the antecedent, and this is going to be the consequence. Think of it like a question and answer. The first one is asking a question. The second one is answering the question. That's kind of how it's set up to be. It's like a phrase or a conversation between 2 people. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to write a little melody. We tend to start that melody on either the root or the third, maybe sometimes the 5th, but usually the root or the 3rd of the chord. So this is an A minor chord, so my notes are A, C, and E. So I'm going to start it on an E. And I'm just going to come up with something here that works well. Okay, so there's my first bar. Okay, now my second bar, I can do anything I want, but I want it to end on not an E and probably not an A. The reason I started this on the 5th will be clear in just a second. Even though I said it's not something we do all the time, it is something that's okay. And I'll show you why I did that just a second. Trust me on that. Just hold on for a second. Okay, so what's my chord here? B and a D. I could call this a 2 chord. I could call it a 5 chord with a missing G. Let's pretend it's a 5 chord. And let's do this. And let's do that. And then we'll leave a rest here. That's kind of cool. Okay. Now, for my consequence, what I'm going to do is the first measure of the consequent is usually exactly the same. And this is why I started on E, because on this chord, so this, I have an E and a B. This is even more of a 5 chord than this was. In this one, we had the 5th of the chord and the 7th of the chord. I don't think we've talked about 7ths yet, but that's going to make it, so the full chord here would be E, G, B, and D would make it a 7th chord. But don't worry about that for now. We'll talk more about 7th chords in the future. So here's an E and a B. So let's treat this again as a 5 chord. So if I put this right here, so the same first measure of the antecedent is now the first measure of the consequent. That more or less works because I have E, D, which is the 7th, and the C is a non-chord tone. That's okay. Okay, now let's go to the second measure. Second measure, I want to do something similar to the second measure of the antecedent, but it's got to change, and I typically want it to resolve onto the root of the chord would be ideal. So what I'm going to do here, and there's a couple different ways you can do this, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same rhythm, except instead of going down to this G, I'm going to go to the root here, which is, what do we want to call this chord? I just have a D and a B, so I could give it 2 different names. I could be a 2 chord, a B, D, F, although that's not, we don't tend to like that chord. It can't be a D, F, A. We could call it a 7 chord by calling it a G, but I used a G down here, and I want this to be different. So let's go to, this chord progression is a tricky one for this. Let's stay on B, how about that? But we'll just go down an octave. So the same rhythm as this, but I'm gonna end on a B. Okay, and then we'll just resolve it to a C here, or an A. Actually, an A might be better. Okay, let's hear what we got. Okay, so you can kind of hear how it's sort of like a question and answer. Here's the question, and here's the answer. So the only thing that's different is these last two notes. But this gives us that repeating stuff that we like. We talked earlier when we were talking about form about repeating things and how that felt good to us. So this antecedent consequent pattern that you can use for melody, but don't have to, but remember that it's an option. It tends to work well because it gives us something familiar very quickly in this bar, between these two bars, and it still makes a nice shape. It makes kind of you could call this an A-B shape on a small scale, right? Like it's just 2 bars of each. So it's different than the form, but it still makes for a very nice melody to do it that way. And remember, you can do this over the course of 4 bars like I did, or 8 bars where the antecedent would get 4 and the consequent got 4. If you were working on a bigger piece, you could even do it over 16, 32, or whatever you wanted like that. So that's how the antecedent consequent relationship works. It's a nice trick for coming up with nice melodies fairly quickly.